Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. Get ready to think a bit differently today. We're looking at sources that, well, they really challenge our basic ideas about reality itself. Thanks for sharing this stuff.
Hmm.
Yeah, we're diving into a concept that asks, what if time isn't just the backdrop? What if it's the actual ingredient? And everything else, even space, sort of emerges from it.
It's definitely a radical idea, yeah.
Yeah.
A real departure from how we usually think in physics, where space and time are like this fixed stage. These sources, they propose a framework where space is literally the geometry that arises from time processes, dynamic, interacting ones. And they suggest this perspective might, shed light on some really old puzzles in physics. Gives us a totally wild new angle on something as everyday as, well, a photon.
Okay, intriguing. Let's unpack this then. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore this framework. We need to get the key concepts straight, look at the main equation they propose, see how it handles light, and touch on those big paradoxes it apparently addresses. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so first, we need to redefine some terms, just as the sources lay them out. Forget time as a river. Here, time is just ordered change. State A changes to B, B changes to C. Simple sequence. If nothing changes, then there's just no time.
No change, no time. Got it.
Exactly. And building on that, there's emergent time. Now, this isn't just that simple A to B change. It's more complex. It's when those sequences of change interact, become recursive. Think cycles, loops, feedback. It's almost like time about time, a kind of higher order pattern that emerges.
Okay, so basic time is change. Emergent time is like complex looping change. What drives this emergent time? What governs it?
Right. The sources identify three key properties of a system that govern it: coherence, C; information density, I; and energy.
C, I, and E.
Okay. Let's take coherence C first. It's basically a measure of order or alignment within the system. Think about how consistently parts relate to each other, like a perfect crystal versus just a jumble of atoms. It represents geometric order or constraints holding things together. They scale from 0, which is total chaos, to 1, perfect order. So higher coherence, the sources say, means the system experiences more emergent time.
More order, more time. Makes sense in a way. What about information density?
Information density. This isn't just raw data bits. It's about meaningful, structured connections. Distinguishable interactions per unit of, well, not space yet, per unit of the system. Think complexity, like a detailed blueprint versus a blank page. Higher I, more meaningful structure, also leads to more emergent time.
Okay, C is order, I is meaningful structure. And both mean more time. Now, energy E.
Energy E. This is defined in a really interesting recursive way. It's the rate of change of information density over some reference time. So way E, frac DITT sine. Energy exists because meaningful structure is changing over time. It's not just a separate thing plugged in.
Whoa, okay, so E depends on the change in I over time.
Yeah.
That sounds tightly wound already. Time is change, emergent time is recursive change, governed by order C, structure I, and energy E, which itself depends on how structure changes over time.
Exactly. It's a self-referential loop. And these pieces all come together in the main equation the sources propose for emergent time. Score T times frac TE.
Okay.
Conceptually, what this equation is saying is that emergent time T goes up with coherence C and information density. So more order, more structure, you get more experience time in that system. But notice energy, E, is in the denominator. It's inversely related. Higher energy means less emergent time.
Okay, hang on. This is where my brain loops, like you said earlier. E is in the equation for T, but you just defined E using the rate of change of I over time, DIDT tref. How can you define E using T when E is in the definition of T? It feels circular.
It is circular, or rather recursive. That's the whole point, the elegance of it, though it's tricky at first. You don't calculate them independently and just plug numbers in. T, C, I, and E are all mutually dependent. They're intertwined. They have to satisfy all the definitions and relationships at the same time. It's like a self-consistent field. Imagine an ecosystem, right? Predator numbers depend on prey depend on plants depend on sunlight and predators. You can't just calculate one population in isolation.
Okay. So it's not plug-and-play math. It's like finding a stable balance point for the whole system.
Precisely. The equations, like T tor E times IE or WEG, the DIDT refer, and even rearranging them algebraically like VD fran T times I2, they aren't just calculation tools. They describe the constraints the whole system must obey to exist stably.
That framing helps a lot. Okay, so we have these interdependent elements. How does this lead to the really big claim that space itself emerges from time?
Right, that's the core assertion. The sources argue that space is the geometry that arises from the coherence of multiple interacting emergent time cycles. Picture several of these recursive time processes happening near each other. They interfere, right? like ripples meeting on a pond. When these interference patterns stabilize, lock into consistent relationships with each other, they form, essentially, fixed points. They define dimensions. That stable reference frame is what we perceive as space.
So space isn't the container.
No, it's the structure formed by these interacting time dynamics settling down. The sources use this analogy. Space is the geometry of emergent time. Each point, each location, is fundamentally a knot of these time processes cohering.
A coherence knot of recursive time. Wow.
They even try to formalize it sometimes,
Yeah.
like X, Y, Z, T, T, space as a tensor product of interacting time flows.
So our everyday 3D world, it's not the stage, it's the outcome, the shape of these time cycles playing out and stabilizing, that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. Completely flips the script. Okay, let's put this to the test. Let's bring in the photon. Physics tells us light experiences zero time in its own reference frame. How does this emergent time idea explain that?
Yeah, the photon is a fascinating test case, and the framework offers a pretty direct explanation using the equation. For a photon, its emergent time t is 0. So we take the equation TdC times frac IE and set t to 0. So
Yeah.
$0 quark TC times frac IE, simple enough.
Right.
Now, for that equation to be true, the stuff inside the square root has to be 0, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So $0 times frac IE must equal 0.
Okay, C times I over E equals 0.
Now, let's think about a photon in terms of C, I, and E, according to this framework. The sources describe a photon as a highly coherent wave, so its coherence, C, is high, definitely not 0. Close to 1, maybe? Carries quantum information, its polarization, its frequency, so information density I is not 0 either. And we know photons have energy, right? EH for HEC. So energy E is absolutely not 0.
Okay, so C is high, I is not 0, E is not 0. But $C times IE, E has to be 0 for T to be 0. How does that work?
Ah, that's the key insight. Since C, I, and E are all non-zero, the only way for the combination $C times IE to equal 0 is if the specific ratio of these non-zero values somehow mathematically approaches 0. The photon's timelessness, T0, isn't because it lacks C, I, or E. It's a direct result of how its specific non-zero amounts of coherence, information, and energy balance out in that particular ratio defined by the equation.
So the timelessness is baked into its very properties through this equation.
Exactly. It's a consequence of the definitions within the framework.
But wait a second. You mentioned earlier, didn't you, that a state of 0E, 0I, and 0C is like timeless nothingness, where existence itself stops. So how can a photon exist if its time t is 0? Isn't that a contradiction?
That's a really important distinction the sources make, crucial clarification. Timeless nothingness is the absolute absence of all three, E0, I0, and C0. Nothing there. A photon, however, is made of non-zero amounts of E, I, and C.
Yeah.
It has energy, it has information, it has coherence. Its T0 isn't due to absence, but due to the specific balance or ratio of these existing non-zero properties. CO times IE evaluates to 0, yielding T0. So the photon exists because it possesses these non-zero E, I, and C. Its existence is defined by them. The T0 is just a consequence of their specific configuration.
Okay. That distinction is critical. It exists because of its EIC, but their balance makes its internal clock stop, essentially. But what happens when it interacts? Like, it hits my eye, surely time seems to pass them.
Right. But the time that seems to pass isn't the photon suddenly starting its own clock. That perceived time passage belongs to the interacting system. Your eye, the detector, whatever it hits. That system has its own C, I, and E values, and thus its own emergent time t. The photon's interaction is like a boundary event. It triggers processes in the other system, causing time to pass for that system. The photon itself, while zipping along, remains internally timeless according to this model.
That makes sense. The interaction happens in the time of the thing being interacted with, not the photon's time. So the photon, which has no time itself, is kind of essential for defining the relationship between events for systems that do experience time. It connects things across space-time.
You could almost see it that way, yeah.
Yeah.
Its propagation defines null intervals, the very structure of space-time causality for everything else.
If you use recursive again, the timeless particle is needed to structure time for everything else.
Wow. And this whole reframing space and time emerging from CIE is then proposed as a way to look at some major paradoxes in science.
How so? Which ones?
We'll take quantum mechanics, the classic puzzle of wave function collapse. In this view, maybe a quantum system before you measure it exists in the state of pure emergent time, like it's all dynamic oscillation, no fixed spatial form yet. The act of observation, interaction, forces that oscillating time state to crystallize. It picks a definite form, position. Time kind of settles into spatial memory.
So collapse isn't some weird magic. It's a phase transition from temporal oscillation to spatial form.
That's the interpretation offered, yes. Or consider cosmology, the perennial question. What happened before the Big Bang? Maybe the question is framed wrong. If space-time emerged, there wasn't a before in our usual sense. Perhaps it was a pre-spatial state, pure oscillation, maybe incredibly high coherence in information, but not yet unfolded into dimensions. The Big Bang, then, could be seen as a kind of coherence collapse. That superdynamic emergent time started to slow, stabilize, and crystallize into the space we now inhabit.
A universe unfolding from pure temporal dynamics.
And think about gravity. General relativity says mass warps space-time. In this emergent time framework, mass itself could be seen as highly concentrated, trapped emergent time. Energy curled up with extreme coherence. This concentration would naturally alter the local flow, the local CIE balance. It changes how time transitions into space right there. So the warping isn't just an abstract geometric effect. It is the effect of concentrated time processes altering the emergence of space. Gravity becomes the tension between time flowing and space forming.
Okay, so rather than cramming quantum weirdness or the Big Bang into a fixed space-time box, this framework suggests the box itself, space and time, are the phenomena that arise from these deeper CIE dynamics. That's a fundamental shift.
It really is. And that recursive nature we talked about, T depending on CIE, while E depends on the change in I over T, is seen as a core strength. It forces a self-consistency. Everything has to work together.
Right, the balancing act.
And from this interconnectedness, the sources draw a pretty profound implication. If space is the geometry of emergent time, and emergent time depends crucially on coherence, then the photon, which is fundamentally a quantum of coherent oscillation, becomes potentially the prime agent for stabilizing structure, for carrying the ticks of time between systems.
The photon as the stabilizer.
Which leads to this bold statement you might find in the sources. Control whatever makes light or a photon, you can control anything. Within this view, controlling the photon's fundamental generation or properties could hypothetically mean controlling time, photon interactions set clocks, space, interference patterns define geometry, mass matter, if mass is trapped coherence light, and information. Photons carry quantum states.
Wow. So controlling the origin of light could, in this model, literally mean controlling the knobs on reality generation. And that phrase, all space is all time, it's not just poetic. It means space is literally time that's been folded or crystallized into geometry, a structural snapshot of ongoing coherent transformations.
That's the essence of the proposal, yes. Space as a manifestation of time structure.
Okay, let's try to wrap our heads around this. We've gone deep into sources proposing a really mind-bending view. Space isn't the stage. It emerges from this dynamic dance of coherence, information, and energy. Time isn't just ticking away, it's fundamental change, and complex recursive change gives rise to emergent time. We saw how this framework defines C, I, E, and T, how they're all interlinked in that recursive equation due to EC times I, E, O, and how a photon, being timeless, fits perfectly not because it lacks properties, but because its specific non-zero properties balance out to T0 yo. Plus how this lens might offer new angles on huge puzzles like quantum collapse, the Big Bang, and gravity.
That's a good summary. The key elements are time emerges from C, I, E. Space emerges from the coherence of that emergent time. The photon's TRO comes from its specific CIE ratio, distinguishing it from non-existence. And the whole system is deeply recursive and self-consistent.
It's definitely a lot to take in. It suggests a reality that's far more, fluid and interconnected than we usually picture, less static.
Absolutely. And it's important to reiterate, as the sources do, that while this framework seems conceptually powerful and unifying, it's also complex. It still needs a lot more rigorous mathematical development and, crucially, experimental ways to test its predictions.
Right. It's a compelling perspective, but needs the hard science follow-through.
But the conceptual shift itself, thinking of space and time, not as fundamental givens, but as emergent consequences of deeper dynamics, that alone is quite potent.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive exploring space as potentially crystallized time. Hopefully you listening have had some aha moments, or at least some wait what moments, exploring this incredibly interesting possibility with us.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to ponder. If space really is just time folded into geometry and every point you occupy, your very presence is fundamentally a configuration of these recursive time processes. What does that truly imply about our sense of place, of distance, of here versus there, and even our own existence within this ever-unfolding, recursively defined reality?